Hi, this is Tony Ward speaking, and I'm an Associate Professor of Counselling Psychology at the University of the West of England. And this is my colleague, Arnaud Plagnol, who is a Professor of Psychopathology at the University of Paris 8. And this short film is to recap on some of the key points from a paper we will be presenting at the Division of Counselling Psychology Conference in Harrogate in July 2015. And the point of this paper is to illustrate how cognitive neuroscience can be used as a unifying theoretical language in counselling psychology, and we are using, on this occasion, the example of depression. Arnaud has written extensively on this subject before. For example, he published this book in 2004, which describes in great detail how a theory of representation can be used to explain different types of psychopathology, and in particular to capture the classic Freudian defense mechanisms. Whereas I have published a paper in the past showing how neural network type models can be used to model client behavior and capture how clients represent aspects of their world, and this can be used to model people behaving according to Rogerian client-centered type principles, but it can also be demonstrated how such a model will capture phenomena from the psychodynamic perspective, such as transference and countertransference. So the reference for the book I just cited, Plagnol, 2004, is Espace de représentation, théorie élémentaire et psychopathologie. And the paper I just referred to of my own, Ward, 2008, Are Connectionist Models Useful in Counselling Psychology? And this paper is going to refer in some detail to a paper that Arnaud published with Mirabel Saron in 2006, talking about depressogenic schemas and subjective space. So, in this paper, the case of Madame T is outlined in some detail. And you can see a schematic here of Madame T. So, working backwards from her adult life, Madame T became depressed in her 40s, possibly after the death of her father, and some squabbling amongst the siblings about the estate, which seemed to trigger something off for Madame T. She had tried therapy and medication for some years and was eventually referred for cognitive therapy, which was initially successful, tackling her hypercontrol schemas, for example. Eventually there was a blockage, but after further reflection and prompting, the client came to recall some significant issues from around her time of late adolescence, when she was 17. And a family secret emerged that her father had been married before, in actual fact, and this was quite scandalous, particularly within the family, which was quite religious. Well, eventually, after thinking about this, there was another block, but then the client came to recollect something from further back, and in fact there was a resonance from her grandfather and her father, and it turned out that her grandfather had a mistress, which was very scandalous at the time. So after further reflection and work with the client, it became obvious that the schema around vulnerability was the most prominent, and it was suggested that this vulnerability schema, which was all pervading, probably stems from the client's very early childhood environment. So in our schematic here, we have the child's early environment represented by the solid structure of the house, which becomes threatened perhaps by this scandal in the family, which may have caused some friction at home, and maybe a feeling of insecurity in the child's home environment. And this threat and possible pain is dealt with by a splitting in the child's worldview and representation, and so that the negative aspects of the world are invested in a part of representational space which is repressed. However, the theory is that that part of the representation which is repressed can later come to exert an influence and plunge the client into a stage of depression. So this case shows how coping mechanisms can break down in an adult's life, possibly triggered by some event. That the initial schemas which are evident in therapy can be dealt with, and gradually the schematic issues work backwards. However, eventually the client gets all the way back, in many cases, to a very early place, to a very early pain, where in psychodynamic terms there was a splitting in the worldview to protect the feeling of vulnerability and potential pain. And so this theory explains, or our theory explains, how these issues can be represented in a cognitive neuroscience type language, but in fact capture very psychodynamic ideas. And the advantage of doing this is that this cognitive neuroscience perspective can unify many different views of psychotherapy. In the case illustrated here, it shows how the client's issues are very multi-layered and stem back to fundamental issues arising in the client's very earliest years. This allows cognitive science to capture some very classic ideas from psychotherapy, such as the notion of splitting. And we would suggest that this cognitive science representational view can capture other ideas such as repression, projection, etc. And the advantage of this is that this cognitive neuroscience type of theory can be very fine-grained and allow us to make predictions and hypotheses which can then be followed up in further research. So, for example, more research and refinement of these ideas may help us to predict which clients in particular may exhibit a treatment-resistant form of depression. And certainly in the UK at this present time, that could be very useful because it could enable us to target resources for more in-depth psychotherapy at the clients for whom it will be most useful. Further reading around this is out there. For example, Visa Talviti has written an interesting book putting forward a very similar view to that we've expressed, suggesting that in fact the Freudian notion of unconscious can be very well captured in modern neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience type thinking. If you want the opposite point of view, then Eric Lawrence's book is very interesting, in which he puts forward many arguments against cognitive science and against the notion of some kind of cognitive neuropsychotherapy. On the other hand, Warren Treon has just released a very large, compendious book illustrating how network principles, which of course arise from cognitive neuroscience, can be used to explain lots of psychotherapy findings and put forward a unified view again of psychotherapy. So we hope you found this interesting. Thank you.